Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. It came to my attention thanks to some of your comments on my other videos that I haven't taken the time to explain S CHIADO. S CHIADO in Portuguese refers to the way in which S at the end of words or before other consonants sounds like a sh. So today's video is going to be all about the S CHIADO. Let's get started. In order to talk adequately about the S CHIADO, we have to go all the way back to medieval Portuguese, when Portuguese had not yet split from Galician. Indeed, this is when Portuguese was still known as Galaico or Galician Portuguese, and it had a very different sound than the Portuguese and Galician that we know today. This is reflected especially in the way in which a s or a z sound could appear in a word. The way that we spell Portuguese retains a lot of these hints at how things were said in the past as well. As you probably already know, Portuguese spelling is not perfectly phonetic. It's not one letter to one sound. This is especially the case with things that sound like s or z depending on the context. We have s, double s, accented c, and ci and ce, plus z for when it's just z. All of these sounds sound pretty much the same today. They sound like s, which means that words like passar and casar are homonyms. However, that was not always the case. When we go back to the earliest periods of Portuguese, we actually find that accented c, ci, and ce, as well as z, were pronounced with a t or a d sound. In the later medieval period, these would become reduced to a s sound. This s sound is very common in the Iberian Peninsula. It's the way that s is said in a lot of European Spanish, as well as Catalan and other Iberian languages. It should be of no surprise, therefore, that Spanish itself also underwent a very similar sound change at about the same time that Portuguese was undergoing it as well. So the way that we get to S CHIADO in European Portuguese basically comes from the way in which S's in medieval Portuguese evolved over time into the early modern period of European Portuguese. This process wouldn't culminate until about the end of the 17th century, so not until about the mid to late 1600s. That, of course, has direct implications for the split between European and Brazilian Portuguese, and indeed, in Brazil, all of these s-like sounds would go on to become just s and z, like they are today. In Europe, however, things are a little bit different. In the Trás-os-Montes region, especially in rural communities, you can still hear the old distinctions. And indeed, in a general sort of a sense, the s sound prevailed in the north and in Galician. However, in the center and southern regions of Portugal, centered especially around Lisbon, to no surprise, the s developed a little bit differently. Instead of maintaining this sound that sounds like a midway point between s and sh, in Lisbon and in the south in general, they began to speak with the s and z sounds. However, people began to speak with a sh sound at the end of words and before other consonants. We get our first written accounts of this in the late 1600s, where writers are bemoaning the fact that people are speaking like this and encourage people who are trying to speak well not to pronounce things in such a manner. As we know by now, language change most often happens from the bottom of society up, and that is no less the case here, because by the mid-1700s, the sh sound at the end of words and before other consonants was fully consolidated in Portugal. The S CHIADO in such a manner has been a characteristic feature of European Portuguese since that time. So to sum it up very neatly, the S CHIADO in Portugal developed as a direct result of the evolution of the S sounds from medieval Portuguese to the early modern Portuguese period. But it's in Brazil where things get a little bit more interesting. As we know, in Brazil, all of these sounds merged into a s and z distinction. By and large, in Brazilian Portuguese, the S CHIADO is not really present. It is a feature limited to certain specific regions. The most well-known place that Brazil has an S CHIADO is, of course, in Rio de Janeiro. I'm talking specifically about the city because, curiously enough, the S CHIADO does not extend very far out into the state of Rio de Janeiro. But you also hear the S CHIADO in other regions like Santos in São Paulo, along the coastline of Santa Catarina, and especially along the Amazon River in the north. How we got to S CHIADO in Brazilian Portuguese, however, is just slightly more complicated than the popular story. The popular and until recently unquestioned story of how Rio de Janeiro came to have the S CHIADO pronunciation has its origins in Rio in the early 1800s when the Portuguese royal court moved the capital of the Portuguese Empire to Rio temporarily in order to flee the invading French. As the story goes, the Portuguese brought along the aristocratic classes who would already have been speaking with the S CHIADO, and they would therefore influence the speech of those in Rio trying to be more fashionable and appear more aristocratic themselves. From there, the Carioca S CHIADO was born and would stay long after the Portuguese court would leave Brazil and Brazil's independence and so on. However, this breaks down when we actually look at research that deals with writing from that time. There is no writing from this period of time or the ensuing decades to indicate that this is how native Cariocas had come to speak. Indeed, all of the writing throughout the 1800s and the earliest part of the 1900s indicates that this S CHIADO was a very distinctly European Portuguese trait. As it relates to Brazilian Portuguese, this manner of pronunciation was in fact considered an inferior pronunciation and was not widely imitated. There are some other ways in which this breaks down as well. When we look at the way that Cariocas pronounce their words and speak in a general manner, we also notice that they didn't pick up on the other general innovations that European Portuguese had gone through up to that point. Cariocas, simply put, did not adopt other innovations as well, so there's no reason to believe that they exclusively adopted this S CHIADO. If indeed the S CHIADO had come from the Portuguese nobility and people emulating their speech, we would also expect to see other things such as a further reduced vowel structure in Carioca speech. That, however, is not the case, and that not being the case, we have to ask ourselves, how, therefore, did the S CHIADO start popping up in Carioca speech? I talked in my video about the evolution of Brazilian pronunciation about a phenomenon called palatalization. In that context, I focused mostly on the way in which palatalization led to a ch and j sound, especially in the speech in Rio de Janeiro. However, this pronunciation also produced an effect on the S's in Rio as well. We don't start seeing a widespread S CHIADO until the mid-1900s in Rio. This roughly coincides with the increased palatalization in other aspects of Carioca speech. So in all likelihood, the S CHIADO begins to appear in Brazilian Portuguese as a result of a generalized palatalization of Brazilian accents. We can also see this in some of the differences between the S CHIADO in Brazil and Portugal. In Portugal, we have a sort of full S CHIADO, meaning we have S CHIADO so long as S comes at the end of a word or before any other consonant, regardless of what part of the word it's in. So for words that have an S before any other consonant in European Portuguese, we have a sh sound. That means that we have pronunciations like descer or crescer instead of descer or crescer. In Brazil, as you may have guessed, people say descer or crescer without the sh sound. But with regard to palatalization and knowing that certain letters like t and d in Brazil are highly palatalized, something interesting happens even in other regions where the S CHIADO is not so widespread. In the Northeast, for example, it is not unheard of to hear somebody say gostar instead of gostar. This is basically due to palatal approximation, or the tongue getting ready to say a palatalized consonant and therefore incorporating a palatalization to the S sound as well. Indeed, the Northeast itself is kind of a buffer zone between the North and Rio and has a mixed bag when it comes to the S CHIADO pronunciation. The S CHIADO has not developed as much in regions like the South because those regions have tended to palatalize less than other regions in Brazil. So to put it simply, S CHIADO pairs along with ch and j in Brazil and pops up around the mid-1900s as a widespread sound. And there we have the explanation of how we got S CHIADO in both European and Brazilian Portuguese. That's all I got for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. If you did or otherwise found it interesting, give me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make videos about food culture and especially the Portuguese language, which you can find in playlists or directly on my channel and in the eye above. And I will see you next time.